Hey there, friends. I'm back. So for anyone who hasn't been or didn't follow my last couple videos, I was away for 6 weeks working on my final residency for my MFA in playwriting. So again, if you haven't followed my channel for a while, I've got sort of three branches of my life. I've got this that you see here, and then I've got my corporate life, and then I'm also a playwright. Which makes my therapist roll my eyes whenever I sit in his chair and tell him I'm lazy. uh, so for the last 4 years, every summer for 6 weeks, I go off and I take 6 intensive weeks of classes and workshops, and all kinds of guest artists come in, and I've taken some really amazing stuff. And each class, which is about 4 hours, contains about a week's worth of material. So it's a lot. So when we're not in class, I'm also doing my day job, and I'm also reading and writing. This year I read probably about 15 plays. I wrote 3 drafts of what is going to be my thesis play, had a reading of that play as part of a festival of new plays, wrote a new comedy, and wrote an experimental play. I finished a draft of something I had been working before I got there, and barely slept. So I'm back today. I go back to work full time tomorrow. I've been sort of using a lot of vacation time the last 6 weeks to make all that stuff happen. So, but I took today as sort of what I call a re-entry day. But I opened my shop back on Sunday, so I had a client reading or two to do, and so I thought I would just come on and say hi. I missed you. I could see all the videos popping up of the 24-hour tarothon on Sunday, and it looked like that was a lot of fun, and that was a good idea. And I wasn't remotely jealous that I didn't get to be included. Just kidding. Can you tell how tired I am still? So I live in New England. I drove down to Virginia in mid-June, and I just drove back on Saturday. And I'm still not unpacked. And actually, before I left, I went to clean out my old office. I work from home, my day job, I work from home. And so I went to clean out my old office at the company I work for. And so I have boxes there. I've got all my stuff from school. I took apart my office stuff here so that I could transport it with me to Virginia, and it's a mess. My clothes aren't. I have 2 bags of dirty laundry in the back of the car that I have to take in, and it's just sort of everything. So I think a lot of this week will be about being an adult again. But so what this video is going to be, aside from me rambling about school and humble bragging about how much work I did, is to kind of wade back into the water, think about where I'm going for the rest of this year in terms of this channel. I have a couple decks that I worked with while I was away. I didn't have a whole lot of time. I mostly read for myself. I did a couple with and without advice readings. I did take one client reading while I was away, and I sort of instinctively knew I probably should not have. It took me 3 days to get around to do it. I really tried to get them done in 48 hours. I wasn't thrilled. I mean, I think the client was happy with the reading, at least from what the feedback was. But I felt like I could have given more. So for folks who reached out to me during that time, I'm back now if you need anything reading-wise. But I think it's important when I'm doing readings to make sure that I'm focused on that. Given everything I was doing, even if I had free time, essentially what I wound up doing was laying in bed and vegging out, and there wasn't a lot of free time. So what we do, at least the way that I do it, is very cerebral to me, and I need those cerebral energies to be focused, and it's not easy to bring that when you've got a stack of reading and writing on the desk next to you. So yeah, I think, after I came back from the reader studio, I talked about a few things that I think I need to focus on. One of which is just sort of the brand, not necessarily my YouTube channel, because I'm me there, I'm Tom Benjamin here. But my social media, I think I need to think about. I did finally change. So for some reason, I didn't want my real name on my YouTube channel, even though most of you who watch me know it now. And that it wasn't really about you guys. It was more about the other side of my life. But my Etsy shop was under my name. So I put my Etsy name as Tom Benjamin, so that was a little more consistent. I did create a new website and business cards before I went off to the Reader Studio with Tom Benjamin on it. Instagram is sort of the other channel where I spend a lot of time taroting or divinationing, and that's under Ben. So I may split out the two halves of my social media and make my tarot stuff Tom Benjamin and make my theater stuff my Ben, which is the name that I write under. So that's something I'll probably do in the coming months. And then, you know, just to think about what's what. I mean, the next couple of months are going to be crazy because I'm teaching a couple writing workshops here. I still have a couple books, tarot related, that I want to write. I've got a bunch of stuff I want to read. All of the videos that everyone made this summer, I have not really gotten to check out. So there's a lot to do, but I'm excited to be back. So what I'm going to do just in this video is just share with you some thoughts on decks that came into my life over the time I was away at school. I showed you two of them already, which was the Star Tarot and the Enchanted Tarot 25th anniversary. Just to update on those, the Star Tarot I used like exclusively for about a week, and then I don't know, it's an interesting deck, and I think you could hear in my review of it or my walkthrough of it the struggle I was having with it, because there are some cards I love. Some of those cards in that deck are some of the most beautiful iterations of those respective cards. Most of the major arcana I love, and most of the minor arcana I really don't. The cards I like, I love. The cards I don't. And so I don't know how far along that deck is gonna make it in my everyday usage. It really hasn't for the last couple months. Well, it feels like the last couple months. When did I do that video? I think at the end of June, maybe even early July. And here I am. It feels like a couple months later. It's only been 4 weeks since I got it. But I'm glad that I had the experience of looking at it. And I think, you know, having looked at the book, I think that the book and that set is a good starting point. I like that I think it's a great first deck if you want to get someone a deck as a gift and they want to get into that, because I think it combines the various branches of Golden Dawn-based tarot nicely. And that's most readers now are using some iteration of Golden Dawn correspondences, you know, whether they're using the Waite-Smith deck or the Crowley-Thoth deck or one of the many grandchildren of those decks, children and grandchildren of those decks. And you know, while I don't have the same numerological correspondences to the Star Tarot, the deck also goes into numerology. So I actually do think for someone who's looking to get a gift for someone, or if you stumble on my video and you're looking for a good first deck, I would take a look at that one. I think I would add that to sets like the Animal Totem Tarot that I think are really good first decks because of the combination of the cards in the book. The Enchanted Tarot I really like. I did end up getting a used copy because I screwed up a few of the cards with the terrible, shitty corner rounder I bought from a Michaels that was in the process of moving. I was just too impatient to wait, and that's what you get. And that was a hard deck to trim, actually, because the length of the cards made it hard to get a straight line down the side. And so I did wind up having to redo a couple, so I managed to find a cheap copy of that. Really liked that deck more than I thought I would. That deck has always had sort of a Valentine quality to me, so I could see using that a lot for readings around that time of the year, or even coming up with a reading specifically around... I'm very big right now, and have been on the last few months, of decks that, or I'm sorry, spreads and readings that I offer to the public that are very specific, and I think using Valentine or Saint Valentine and the sort of gory quality of that story as a way of exploring the darker shades of relationships, which frankly is often what we want readings about. So there may be something in there I'll play with, and that and the Victorian Romantic deck might be good ones to work with in there. And yeah, I mean, this video is, I'm rambling more now than I meant to, and maybe I'll do Act 2, another video. No, I'll probably just leave it, we can just get to it, whatever. It's been a while, so I'm sort of venting all this stuff. But yeah, in my shop right now, I have 2 readings that I'm really fond of that I keep pitching to people. The first is, I call it the boy bye reading, which is essentially a reading exploring how to get out of a relationship that's not working, particularly a relationship with a narcissist or someone who has those tendencies. And then the other one is a self-care reading that I have done a few times and I really, really like for people. So I may come up with, I don't know, one of the things that I've learned is that when I read for people, they often want a reading, but they don't know what they want me to read about. And so in my shop, the readings that do best are the 6-month forecasts, both Sibylla and Tarot. I do those both Sibylla and Tarot readings. There's a decision spread that I adapted from Benabel Wen's Holistic Tarot book. That one I get occasionally. The forecasts seem to be the most common, but as I start to make more and more specific readings, I think people respond a little bit more to them. So I have fewer and fewer general spreads. And when I do, I think what I have on my shop for general spreads right now is really just a 9 card and maybe the Council of 13. But I think even the Council of 13 works best as a specific question. So anyway, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, those 2 decks. I got a deck as a gift, which I did not show in that video. And I'm going to today. I love Wandering Oracle, and I love the Marshmallow Marseille, and they very generously sent me a review copy, one of the last ones they had, because I wasn't going to get it, because I love my original, and I use it all the time. I actually didn't bring it with me this summer, and I missed it, so I was happy to get this, but I was chatting with them briefly after they showed it on Instagram, and I said, oh my god, it looks even better than I thought it was going to look. They being, I'm a fan. Obviously, I illustrated Tarot on Earth with their deck. Yeah, so they sent me a review copy, so I'm going to review it for you. And then I bought a deck while I was away that I wasn't expecting to like, and I'm going to share that with you too. So I'm going to turn the camera down and stop showing you my mangy face. I really need to do some grooming now that I'm home. Oh my god, 6 weeks. I mean, 6 weeks. It felt like 6 months, but in a good way. I made, the thing about grad school, no matter what you want to do, is, the degree, grad school is expensive unless you make it into a funded programming, and funded programs tend to take maybe 2 or 3 people a year, if that. So they're hard to get into, so it's expensive. But the relationship building, just for those of you that have been to a Newt's or a Reader's Studio or a Tabby or whatnot, I can't remember all the acronyms. Imagine that level of learning spread out over 6 weeks every day. And you kind of have a picture of what my MFA experience was for 4 6-week summers. So anyway, I'm rambling. I also got a book I'll show you. I just started reading it, but I'll show that to you too. So I can't even remember, someone on Instagram had it pictured, and I immediately, of course, had to read it. So I'm going to go do that and look at some new stuff. All right, so I suppose I should probably say, as I get into this video, that the trigger warning is none of these decks that I'm going to mention are back in order. Let me sort of situate myself so I don't bump the camera. So anyway, I mentioned a book in my little long intro, and it's this new translation of Jean-Claude Flournoy's book on Marseille Tarot, which has a different title in French because the French title is kind of untranslatable in English. But this is Seeing the World, Tarot Signposts and Path to Perception by Jean-Claude Flournoy, translated and annotated by David Vine. So before Flournoy died, he had written this book in French and was really anxious to have it translated into English. And I think it's really just been released earlier this year. I don't know if the publication date is in here. It doesn't seem to be. But it's really new, and I hadn't heard of it until last week. I don't know what retailers this is available through, but I think you can get it through the Flournoy Company website, which is Tarot History. But I bought this at the Hermit's Lamp, which is a great Canadian shop, and I ordered it mid last week and I got it today. So, right on. Thank you, Hermit's Lamp. Shipping was not cheap, because, you know, I don't know why we can't figure out international shipping. But anyway, the reason I have this deck out is because this is, of course, his recreation of the Jean Noblette Tarot, which is one of my favorite Marseille Tarots, and you can see, you know, I use it so much the box is worn. The edges are kind of dirty. Although I may have edged this deck, I can't remember. It's not the easiest shuffling deck, but I love it so much. So I was really excited for Florinai's book. I have only gotten to about 30 pages in it. I just sort of picked it up when it came in the mail. Like a lot of Marseille books, it focuses primarily on the trumps or the majors. I think there's only one chapter on the minors, but I'm excited to get his point of view. There aren't a lot of books on Marseille reading and decks. I have recommendations in other videos, but off the top of my head, there's Tarot, the Open Reading by Yoav Bendov, which was republished as the Marseille Tarot Revealed. There, Camélia Elias has a couple books. There's the Jean-Michel David giant book, which I love. Oh, why can't I remember his name right now? I can't even see the book on the shelf. It is Tarology by... It's such an easy name to remember. I'll try to remember to put it in the description. I can't even see it on my shelf right now. And then there's The Way of Tarot by Jodorowsky, which I do not care for. So anyway, this is a nice addition to that collection. So I'm happy to have these two together, and I'm excited to work on it. So while I'm on the topic of Marseille, let's just take a quick look at the Marshmallow, which I was very excited again to review. I have my original copy over here. Again, it's gotten kind of beat up, but just to compare them quick, I think there are a couple comparison videos already. You know, it came in this box, which again is pretty worn out. But I loved this deck and really everything about it aside from the box. One of the best shuffling decks ever. Loved the colors, loved the cardstock, loved the size. So a deck that is definitely one that I carry around with me very often. I hate the word very. So I wasn't going to get this one, or maybe I would get it as a backup. But again, things worked out differently. So one thing right off the bat is this is great packaging. I know there have been some photos out there about damaged boxes, but I think those are few and far between. Even if, you know, I mean, it would take a minute to hurt this thing, because it really is beautifully packaged. The box is really nicely constructed. And then the cards are the same size. The coloring is the same. The stock is a little glossier. And because there's this sort of, I don't know if you can see it even in the video, there's this, yeah, you can a little bit. There's this kind of holographic stamping on the back. You can see, I can't even see it right now, kind of. I don't know if I can make that clear in the video. Anyway, there's a little bit of an imprint of it on the back, but it's almost imperceptible unless it's really in the light. But the cards are the same, there's no change to them. Colors pop slightly because the cards are slightly glossier, but nothing major. So really the only major difference is the stock's a little glossier, but it shuffles just as well. The box, obviously, and then the backs. You know, to be honest, I didn't need that embellishment, but it's actually subtler than it looked for me. And it still shuffles really nicely. I will say that after riffle shuffling it a few times, I noticed I got a lot of sort of sparkly particulate in the air and on my laptop. But I would say, you know, if you had wanted this deck and you missed out on the first version, you're getting a better box and, you know, a subtle change. Again, I don't think I needed that, but people like glitz. I've seen some folks edge the ends of it in silver, which I think could look really cool. I go back and forth on whether or not I have the patience to edge things, so. But I'm loving this deck, and I think they really thoughtfully redesigned the packaging, and I think that's really great. So kudos to Wandering Oracle, and thank you again for for, you know, all the kindnesses that you've extended me. So a very good friend of mine in my MFA program surprised me one day with this, which is the Bosco Tarot, the tarot of, I think that's Bosch, Hieronymus Bosch, if I'm not mistaken. So total surprise and total, you know, I just love when people do things like that. And the fact that it was a deck I never would have gotten was kind of great. Yeah, the Bosco Tarot, Hieronymus Bosch. Thought so. As I mentioned, none of these are in order. I really love this artwork, and Bosch always sort of freaked me out, but I really quite like this deck. There's only one thing I hate about it, which is that the Magician and the Ten of Cups, I think, are the same exact card, and that makes zero sense to me. I literally cannot wrap my mind around why that. Like, you couldn't find one more image for one of those. Not my favorite backs, but it shuffles nicely. Not a deck I ever would have bought for myself, because I know his work mostly as sort of this surreal, kind of creepy thing, but I don't find this deck particularly creepy, although it very clearly is otherworldly. But it's very rich. The coloring is great. I'm among those who really is not bothered by multiple languages on Los Scarabeo cards. I actually kind of like that. I like the universality of that. So that is a deck I was not expecting and not expecting to like. I do wish the Magician and the Ten of Cups were different images, because that makes it confusing in a reading. But really thoughtful. You know, gifts always stun me, because you know, it's just really cool. And then the last one, this part of the video is going to be shorter than my intro. So I have an interesting, not that interesting story, which is that I found, so I had not really looked at this deck much because I'm not a big fan of decks that have modern images on them, which is idiotic of me, right? Because I'm constantly complaining about the lack of diversity in decks. Most of the decks I'm using now are old recreations, or a lot of them anyway, where there's no chance of diversity. And in part, one of the reasons I do that is because they have a very flat, you know, sort of weirdly inhuman quality to them. Or I'm using decks with a lot of animals in them, because then I bypass people completely. So I was at the Reader Studio and sat next to Arwen for a bit, and she was using the, I think, self-published version of this deck, which is still available and is very expensive. So expensive, in fact, that Joanna Powell Colbert offers a payment plan. And I would have preferred to get that version, but I bristle a bit at spending that much for a deck that I hadn't gelled with yet. Even for a deck I had. I think the most expensive deck I have is the Tildwick, which was shipping was over $100. That includes out of print decks that I bought. So I wasn't prepared to do that, especially because I wasn't sure if I was going to like it. I was trawling the internet as I do, and I found a copy of the Llewellyn edition, which was the first mass-produced edition, for $60, and I snapped it up. And got an email about a week later saying, oh, by the way, it's not the deck, it's just the book, so I canceled that. So that was a little bit of a heartache. So I was really interested in the deck, you know, after having come close to gotten a smaller, non-Schiffer version of it, because we love what Schiffer is doing with packaging. We love that they're bringing decks to the world that would not be out there. Otherwise, we love the books. We are struggling, I think, by and large, with the cardstock, with the size of their decks, with the giant borders they seem to be really fond of. So we struggle, right? And many of us have modified a lot of Schiffer decks as a result, but the one thing you can't really modify is that sticky laminate. But after having a decent experience shuffling the Star Tarot, I decided to give this one a go. So, you know, and one of the things that happens is I don't get mail while I'm away at school, so you order things, or I order things as a way of sort of validating the male bug. So anyway, typical beautiful Shiver packaging, great book. I think again, this is a great book for, this is a great set for someone as a gift if you want to give them the gift of a starter deck. And I don't mean that this is a starter deck, but when I'm looking at what makes a good beginner deck, or and what I mean by that is someone who is interested in starting out and wants a deck, I think about the combination of the deck and book. And so I think this also fits into that category because the book is really good. It's really thorough, covers a lot, and it has, you know, a really good deck with it. So always prefer that decks come, you know, in one stack, though I tend not to leave them in the boxes they came in. But I just, you know, this thing always kind of irritates me. But as readers, we all tend to be fairly easily irritated. So this deck is kind of famous now, and I'm not going to do a whole walkthrough of it. It's kind of famous now for the size and for these really bizarre blue borders that were added to them, which were in no other version of the deck. You'll also notice that they are silver edged, which is quite nice. So I got the deck assuming that I would probably trim it. But one of the things I noticed right out of the gate is that the blue border is not the same size on both sides, and the image is not always centered within. And while it looks like the back sort of is, and I could probably trim along the back, there's also the issue of the corners, and I just decided that I would only make that investment in time and energy if I really needed to. I have not read the whole book, but I did, you know, go through it. And again, I think this is an excellent guidebook for a deck, because the cards get a lot of information, and she really does define in the book what she put in each image and why, what it's meant to mean. Now, I'll say this: when you're starting out, I think I think as a reader who's a mature reader, I like to know why an artist did what they did and put that in there, and I like to know why they chose the things they chose and what they symbolize. I feel like when you're starting out, that can be a little overwhelming, because you try to sort of get every symbol interpreted, and of course that's not really how things go. But I do think it's useful to be in there. So I think this is a great set for someone starting out, particularly someone who cares about diversity, cares about the environment, etc., and doesn't mind modern images. Now, as I said, this was a thing that I was dubious about, because I don't particularly like modern life intruding, oddly, even though it's such a weird dichotomy for me, because I really do believe that decks should have diversity in them. I really do think we need to represent the world as it's existing around us. I think that tarot speaks to modern life. I have a very practical, exoteric view. I don't subscribe to a lot of the Golden Dawn spirituality or etc. So it's interesting that I get that way, but I don't know why. But anyway, I decided to put that aside for this deck. So I'm just going to sort of yap as I go through this. So there are a handful of cards I don't like in this deck. One of them is this one. But for the most part, actually, I really do think it's beautiful. And the ones that I don't like tend to be the ones that look a little bit like manipulated photographs. As far as I understand them, these are all paintings, and maybe in a smaller size, some of them looked a little less manipulated, but there are a handful that look manipulated like photographs, which is never a thing that I love. But those aside, I actually think it's really kind of beautiful, and I have done a few readings for myself with it and found it really nice and really evocative, and I found that it reads really well. There are some themes in this deck that you'll see pretty consistently throughout other modern decks, so you will get chakras, etc. I do think there could be fewer white people in this deck, but it is fairly diverse. And even as I say that now, I think I may be thinking of another deck. But the modern life intruding on this deck does not bother me really that much. There are a couple cards that kind of do. And that's just a taste thing, you know, that's the case in any deck. And part of what I do when I talk about a deck is I talk about things that I like and things that I don't like, because that may inform your decision, right? So the art style is very different from place to place, but it does seem to embrace a lot of cultures. It seems to embrace a lot of really interesting pictorial representations of cards that we're really familiar with. So there's a thing that happens in this deck where, which is actually, believe it or not, something I like to do as a writer, which is to take an old story and draw a line between it and what we experience in modern life today. I feel like that's what she's done with a lot of images in the cards, is she's taken these old stories, these old images, and drawn a line between that and the life we're living today. And in that regard, I think that it really succeeds. The courts have been renamed, and it probably would have been smart for me to put them in order just to tell you what they are, but there may be a thing in the book that... Yes, Child is Page, Explorer is Knight, Guardian is Queen, and Elder is King. So even for people who have a thing about modern decks, I actually would encourage you to take a chance with this one. This may be a nice gateway, because I think there's enough diversity. I think there's a timeless quality to many of the images. You know, here's a card I'm not a big fan of. I don't know why, even though it's very diverse. There's just something about it that to me reads a little like, I don't know. It just doesn't, it's not my favorite, but a lot of them are. So now we get into the, it's not that it's a very white deck. There's a lot of diversity. It's a very heterosexual deck. That was one thing. I don't think there's a single card in the deck that makes me think that it represents queer or LGBTQ plus people. So that's one criticism I have from a diversity standpoint. Now, the question, of course, with Shiver decks is always, how does it shuffle? I have found this to be one of the better shuffling Shiver decks that I've experienced. The stock is not especially sticky. You can't riffle shuffle it end to end, but it does riffle shuffle side to side really nicely, and there's not a lot of grip. In fact, the grip seems to happen most with the overhand shuffling. But even that, so from a shuffling standpoint, actually, I had really low expectations for this deck, but for some reason, you know, and it's an interesting thing with Shiver decks, right? Because when I got the Bonefire, I remember I did a review. It's probably one of my least liked videos. Probably the most thumbs down of any video I've ever made for some reason. And one of the things that people commented on was that I found the deck really sticky, and a lot of people haven't had that experience. I have not had a remotely sticky experience with this one. Could depend upon the humidity. It could depend on the batch of decks that you got. I don't know. But I actually find that this one shuffles really well, despite the size. The cardstock is flexible enough to do this, and I have relatively small hands. So from a shuffling standpoint, great. I guess the one thing from a size... Oh, God, I hate that Lover's card. I know that's terrible. It just looks like two happy white hippies, which, let's be honest, is probably who would love this deck most. I tend to do a lot of large spreads. I can't do a large spread and get it into a video on my reading space with cards this size, but I will probably not trim them. If I do decide to trim them, I'll probably get a used copy and trim that. Whoops, I don't know how often I'll use this for other people, but I have used it for myself a lot. And I've really liked it. And I can see, you know, Arwen told me when we were at the Reader Studio and I saw her with this deck, and I mentioned that I'd had my eye on it but never really explored it. She said it's probably her favorite, or one of her most used decks. In fact, this card reminds me of her because this is a card that she pulled for herself while we were doing the Mary Kate Greer lessons at Reader Studio. So anyway, so yeah, I actually do like this deck. I love when a deck surprises me and my expectations are astute, because this one definitely did. And I think I'm a happy camper that it's there. I do wish it were smaller. I think the pictures although they breathe more in this size, it's just, you know, as I always say, tarot's a practical art, right? And so I would rather have something that's easy to fit in the hand, easy to throw in my backpack, and easy to lay out a lot of cards in a small space than giant art cards. But I do have decks that are huge, and then I love them, like the Vampire Tarot, like the Tarot Noir, the Inner Child cards, which I don't use much, but those are pretty big, and very sticky cardstock, by the way. So yeah, and then I have a couple Oracle decks that are large too. Although I don't tend to use Oracle decks that much, and when I do, I'll use 1 or 3 cards. So anyway, yeah, that's just my little sort of, these are the decks that came into my life this month. The ones that I've been working with. I think probably this one was the one I worked with the most. You know, I think sometimes decks arrive in our lives at a time where they have something to say to us. And I don't have a very mystical approach to this, but the Wildwood Tarot had that experience. This I haven't had time to work with as closely as I did the Wildwood during Into the Wildwoods back in November, but I think that this one was similarly vocal and helpful. So yeah, so I'm happy to be back, and I'm looking forward to catching up as much as I can, and hope you're doing well, and we'll talk soon.